Welcome to this webinar. I'm Patrick Hoverstadt.
I'm Lucy Lowe.
And in this session we aim to give you a taster of patterns of strategy, which is a new paradigm for strategy development, really different to existing approaches. It's based on systemic principles, so it focuses on the relationships between different actors in your strategic context and the fit between your organisation and its strategic environment. Developing strategy is about designing the key strategic relationships which your organisation has so that they work to your advantage. It's quick to learn the basics and it's fast to use too, which is in itself a benefit.
There's something of a schism in strategic thinking between deliberate and emergent strategy. A deliberate approach treats strategy as an intent that typically gets formalised into a strategic plan. Strategy tends to be both thought of and executed as a mental construct, the plan, some documents, some models, some projections. It's the output of decisions by, usually, senior leaders. By contrast, emergent strategy sees the strategic direction of the organisation being driven by a set of forces that influence both actions and decision-making of the management team. As Mintzberg said, strategy is a pattern in a stream of actions. So emergent strategy literally is the strategy which emerges, the one which the organisation actually executes, whatever the intentions of the senior team. Within deliberate or conventional strategy, there are two major viewpoints from which strategy is developed. Some approaches take a market-based view, choosing where to play, which markets with which products, depending on which markets and segments look financially attractive, and that's generally called an outside-in approach. Or there are inside-out approaches which start from the inside, looking at what the organisation is good at, its capabilities. And once those capabilities are clear, the approach is to look for market opportunities where your core capabilities will be valued. But whichever of these you take, you're only looking at less than half the picture, and both of these have a significant problem, and it's that they don't take into account what others are doing and how fast they might be doing it. They exclude the possibility of change, of the environment changing. They assume everything outside your organisation is pretty stable and in fact require everything outside your organisation to be pretty stable too. But demonstrably it isn't, and it's not going to be. So we need a different model of strategy development, one which allows us to take into consideration the actions of others when we develop our strategy. But although there are lots of methods and tools for deliberate strategy, when it comes to emergent strategy, there's been nothing that practitioners can actually use.
Whatever the conventional strategy approach, there's a dominant narrative which sees strategy as a journey. This is where we are, this is where we need to be, and this is the route from here to there. But in practice, it's not really like that. There are multiple interdependent actors operating in your environment, each with their own will, and their conscious or unconscious actions may get in your way, or perhaps be helpful. Perhaps you had a plan A of where you were heading, but those other organisations also had their own plans which can bring their actions and intentions in contention with your actions and intentions, which means that you have to alter your chosen outcome and also the route map of how to get there, and suddenly you're doing plan B. All these other actors have the potential to destabilise you, and of course it's bound to be like that. With lots of other actors in the same space, how could it be otherwise? In patterns of strategy, we accept that from the beginning, that there are multiple actors manoeuvring in the same places as us, and we purposefully design strategy which takes that into account. Conventional strategy ignores what other actors are doing and just focuses on our intended destination. Now imagine trying to drive down a busy motorway in the way we normally do strategy, ignoring what all the other drivers in our strategic environment are doing. You wouldn't get very far. In fact, you wouldn't get more than a few kilometres without crashing. Conventional strategy is quite abstract. It's a mental construct about what we plan and what we would like to happen. By contrast, this is much more gritty and real capabilities and people doing real things in real places. Strategy as a set of manoeuvres that organisations execute, and we're primarily interested in what is happening and where that will take us, and only then look at what we can do about it. The manoeuvring is also important. Much of conventional strategy is static, snapshotted at a point in time, but in practice strategy is played out as a dynamic. It's a dance or a hard-fought match on a sports field. I do something, you do something. I manoeuvre, you manoeuvre.
But as well as all that, there's another compelling chain of thought which was the initial trigger for the development of patterns of strategy, and it's this. There's many studies which look at how strategy is delivered, the proportion of those which are fully implemented and deliver the expected outcome. The most generous research suggests that more than 70% fail to deliver, and most come in with a failure rate of around 90%, with one at 98%. So if you believe those studies, then the most persuasive reason to change strategy approach is this: conventional approaches don't work. Of all the people we've talked to about patterns and all the people we've trained and all the organisations where we've supported strategy development, no one has ever said, "Oh no, those figures aren't right," or "That's not how it is here." Generally, folk look at us a bit ruefully and nod and say, "Yes, that's how it is for us." But as well as being concerned about that failure rate in its own right, it also raised a much deeper question for us. Organisations and businesses and markets and regulators are all changing all the time, and sometimes substantially. So if it's not the strategy execution which is bringing about the changes, what is it?
And to answer that question, we turn to a biological model from Chilean biologist Humberto Maturana, and it's his idea of structural coupling. It's a really simple idea, but one with profound implications. In biology, structural coupling is the process by which an organism interacts with its environment in such a way that the organism changes the environment and the environment changes the organism. They co-evolve to fit. So the hummingbird's beak develops to fit the flower, and the flower develops to fit the hummingbird's beak. Through the generations of flowers and hummingbirds, each adapts to fit the other. It's a structural coupling because in the coupling, each is changed structurally. And it shifts our focus from the individual organism, the hummingbird or the flower, to the relationship between them. Now, transferring the model to organisations and their environment is also really simple. Organisations are structurally coupled to their environment. Some of the couplings are with other organisations, some with the sectoral market. Organisations tend to have multiple structural couplings, and each has a structural effect on the organisation, and the organisation has a structural effect on the actor at the other end. You start to organise your activities to address the demands of that coupling, and as you do, it changes you and vice versa. Multiple co-adaptations. Given what we said about traditional approaches focusing on the organisation or the market, we've shifted our focus to the relationship between them, the structural coupling. And for organisations, it's about using their structural couplings to get the best possible strategic fit.
So patterns of strategy looks at the relationship between different actors, between the organisation and its environment or market. Not just one end of the relationship, because seeing the whole is really important. One end of the relationship in isolation doesn't make sense. And as we look at the relationship between the organisation and other actors, we get a strong sense of the dynamic, the manoeuvring, the nature of the interaction between the two actors and the trajectory of the relationship between them. Where will it take each actor given its momentum and direction? And it's understanding and harnessing this inherent momentum which is at the heart of patterns of strategy. It focuses on achieving fit, strategic fit between the organisation and its environment, and strategic fit between the organisation and the other actors it's structurally coupled to.
And there is no single right answer, or even two right answers, as in a Porterian view of strategy. Organisations operate in a huge range of strategic contexts, and so there are many different ways to achieve a good strategic fit. Just as for the birds and their beaks, organisations can change in a variety of ways to achieve a fit in a way which delivers advantage for them.
Structural couplings have a natural trajectory, a natural path they will take the actors down. And as the organisation interacts with those other actors it's coupled to, it's presented with threats and with opportunities. The coupling exerts pressure. And as you change and move forward in response to those pressures, those demands, those opportunities and threats, your perspective changes very slightly, so that now you can see somewhat different threats and opportunities. Each time you change, you move a bit more down that path, and each individual step can be so small that it's almost invisible. In the moment, each micro step looks appropriate, and looking back along the path, it looks like conscious choice, but mostly the direction is driven by the situation and by the dynamics of the structural coupling. A structural coupling view of strategy doesn't mean that it's conscious. When we talk about strategy in patterns of strategy, we're not necessarily talking about any sort of plan or even anything that's intentional. There may be forks in the road, alternative paths you could take or could have taken, but generally the structural coupling does what the structural coupling does. It takes you and the other actor along on its trajectory with its inertial momentum. It's a set of natural forces that drive organisations in a particular direction as a default, unless you intervene to change its nature and direction.
And all that takes us to some key questions about the couplings you've got. So, firstly, what structural couplings are you in? You'll have lots of relationships, but not all of those will be structural, capable of changing you or the other actor structurally. For each of them, what's its default trajectory? Where's it going to take you? And then there's a couple of so what questions. Is that somewhere you want to go? If so, that's fine. But if not, you need to intervene. And finally, what will that turn you into? And this identity question is often really important indeed.
Unless you're a startup, you'll have multiple structural couplings with your market, with competitors, with partners, and maybe with a regulator or two as well. So strategy is about managing that set of couplings to your advantage. You can change which couplings you have, add one or remove one, or more usually change the characteristics of the couplings you've got so that they're more to your advantage. Each coupling will exert pressure or tension on you to move in particular directions, and some will have a greater effect than others. But your overall strategic direction is the product of all of these. So when Henry Mintzberg talks about emergent strategy, this is how emergent strategy emerges, and it's these forces, the couplings, that drive it.
Let's draw that all together into a definition of strategy. So we define it as changing our fit with the environment to our advantage by concentrating power in time. It's about fit, strategic fit, and improving that by managing our structural couplings in a purposeful way instead of just being managed by them in an unaware way. To our advantage is about beating others in a competitive situation. If we're in a collaborative one, it's more nuanced, and to our advantage will require us to think about and honour our partner's needs too. Patterns of strategy uses time as well as power. Overall, it has these three critical dimensions: fit, time and power. And each has a number of elements. We use these elements to describe and define structural couplings, and we'll go through each element in turn.
So fit has three elements, and differentiation is the first. It's a core concept in patterns of strategy, and it's about the degree to which we are the same or different to others. There are 3 degrees of differentiation: herd, edge and individual. In any sector there are typically many organisations, and generally there's a herd, a group of very similar organisations that tend to act similarly and serve similar markets with very similar offerings. And that herd will have an edge, a boundary, which serves to define which organisations are in the herd and which aren't. So edge is the in-between position. It's somewhat differentiated. It's linked to the sameness of the herd, but it's exposed to and it benefits from the variety in its wider environment. Edge organisations then frame the herd, with leading organisations setting the direction and pace of herd movement, and laggard organisations showing the gap between the front and the back of the herd. The herd has momentum and a trajectory. It will be moving, even if only gradually. And you can tell where the leading edge is because those are the organisations which are setting the direction for the herd and are copied by the other herd members. As Walter Bennis has said, the definition of a leader is that they have followers. And the lagging edge is made up of those who are trying to keep up with the rest of the herd. And there are also edge positions at the side which are neither lagging nor leading. And so an organisation at the side is more differentiated than one in the centre of the herd, but the rest of the herd isn't following them. The most differentiated position is individual, and an individual is part of the same ecosystem as the herd but stands apart from it, separate from it, and they're different in what they do or how they do it. An individual can set the direction for the herd from that separate position, although that's not its intent. Or they can hold on to values which the herd has abandoned, or just do their own thing in a particular market niche or segment.
Drive is the second element of fit, and it's about who is the main driver of change within the coupling. Often one actor is initiating change in the other actor in the coupling much more than the other way around. The first organisation is shaping and the other is reacting. You doing something isn't necessarily a shaping action. To shape, you must trigger a reaction in the other actor. This can make it harder to spot, and we often find situations where each actor in a coupling thinks the other is shaping them because each only sees the effect on themselves rather than the effect they're also having on the counterparty. In other cases, the actors within the coupling co-evolve, with each making changes that affect the other to a roughly even degree or jointly influencing the environment of which the coupling is a part. Here, both of the actors are changed. So the three options for drive are shape, co-evolve and react, and of course are in pairs. If one actor is shaping, the other is reacting, or both co-evolve together.
Part of the definition of a structural coupling is that it creates change, and stretch is about the nature of that change in each actor as a result of the coupling. There are 5 possible positions: incremental, radical, disruptive, paradigm shift and confound. 4 of these are on a continuum, the other is different in kind, and confound is a deliberate intent to destabilise another actor. In terms of risk and reward, each of these degrees of stretch has a different profile, and what's attractive to you will depend on your appetite and on the rate of change in the environment. How much stretch do you want or need? Putting confound aside, there are additional risks to regularly using only the low orders of stretch. If the environment is volatile or uncertain, then only those low orders of stretch might not be sufficient, and you may end up in a world where the risk-reward profiles feel rather different. So there are obvious strategic advantages to having more than one type of stretch in your repertoire.
Time is about differentials in our speed and rate of change relative to others. In patterns of strategy, one possibility is a faster-slower relationship in which one actor moves or changes significantly faster than the other. And if one actor is faster, then the other is obviously slower. The alternative is both actors are synchronised and move and change at a similar rate. Speed for each actor is defined in relation to the other actor, where there is a significant differential in their pace of action or change, whether strategic or operational. The relative speed could show up in different ways, such as the speed of a core process, product refresh rate, the time for a decision action cycle, or the rate at which the organisation can change its capabilities. Not all of these will be significant to the coupling, so it's about identifying which of the relative speeds are important in our particular context.
If you want to alter the relative speed in your coupling, then one or more of these 3 enablers will help you to do that. There's foresight, change rate and cycle time. Foresight is the prediction and interpretation of changes in the environment, and it's the organisation's ability to sense and make senses of those changes in the environment before these hit. Change rate is the rate of developing or adapting capabilities, and this is about how much change you can carry out in a given time period, usually a window of opportunity or a risk. Being able to use multiple change rates in your organisation will give you the most choice on what strategies to use and when you might use them. Your organisation has to be able to evolve in step with the rate of change in your environment, so change rates don't necessarily have to be fast, they just have to be appropriate for the situation you're in. But normally they need to be at least as fast as the changes in the environment, and if you're in a competitive situation, then faster than your competitors too. And all that makes managing the rate of change incredibly important for organisations and businesses, and yet it's not often looked at. The third enabler is cycle time. That's the rate of delivering each iteration of a core process. That could be an operational cycle time, the rate for turning the handle on production or delivery processes. And there's also decision action cycle time, and that's about the speed with which management teams can translate information about a new situation into a decision and then into action. The decision action cycle is often relatively easy to change, only a small number of people doing something differently, and it can offer huge leverage, so it's always worth thinking about this. There are trade-offs between these enablers. Better foresight gives you more lead time, so if your foresight is good, then this can be a substitute for improving the rate of change or the cycle time.
Power is about the differentials in our resource and capability and their deployment relative to others. In patterns of strategy, there are two ways of looking at power. One is about absolute amounts of power, and we call this strength. In strength, one possibility is a stronger, weaker relationship in which one actor is significantly stronger than the other. And if one actor is stronger, then the other is by definition weaker. The other possibility is that both actors are about balanced in strength. There are lots of different forms of strength, and each actor may have several which matter. That could include factors from market access to geographical spread, from brand to expertise and R&D, unique skills, so on and so forth. What's important is the net differential in strength between the two actors in this particular coupling.
The other way at looking at power is concentration, which is the degree of focus of capabilities and resources. So given all the strength that you have, there are choices about how you distribute it across different goals and objectives. So the total strength is important, but also how it's applied, how much it's concentrated or spread out. So each actor can concentrate on one thing, or several things, or many things. And each actor has the same choices, single, multiple, or diffuse. As always in patterns, these don't have to be absolute, as we're interested in concentration relative to the other. If overall you're weaker, then one way to mitigate that is by increasing your concentration so that you can gain a localised strength advantage.
Just as for time, there are power enablers which can be used to alter the power differential between the two actors. If you want to alter the power differential in your coupling, then one or both of these enablers will help you do that. So the first of those is critical mass, which is the deployment of sufficient resource to significantly shift the balance of power. As we described earlier, power comes in many forms, from territory to IP to ownership of a standard. So bringing critical mass to a coupling could involve bolstering an existing form of power or adding a new one, enough to shift the balance of power. The other power enabler is agility, and we define agility quite precisely as resource or capability that is immediately redeployable. Agility generally needs planning and comes with a price tag. It requires some organisational slack as it needs resource in waiting or easily withdrawn from other non-critical areas. Highly efficient or lean organisations don't often have this and find it hard to redeploy at speed. It's not just about having a pool of resources quietly waiting. You need to know how much resource you might need and of what type, and also how quickly you might want to turn on the resource tap. If it's about redeploying money, that's relatively easy, provided you've got a war chest in the first place. But some capabilities take time to develop, so it takes thought to define what agility you want to have available and how much you're willing to pay to have that agility potential.
You may have noticed that a lot of our definitions are about relativity, the differential between the two actors in each of the 6 elements. Time, for example, we defined as the differentials in our speed and rate of change relative to others. So it's not the absolute which matters, but the differential. Think about it like the weather. It's the differentials between high pressure and low pressure weather systems that generate the winds. Differentials provide energy. And if you transpose that idea to a structural coupling, then when the differentials are low, the structural coupling is pretty stable and changes only slowly. There simply isn't enough difference to create energy in the relationship. But where the differentials are high, and especially where the differentials in fit are high, then the structural coupling is of high energy. There's a lot more going on. The degree of differential makes a difference depending on your strategic context. In competition, any degree of differential can be used to your advantage, but in collaboration, there's a differential sweet spot. Enough differential to make collaboration worthwhile, but not so much that the two actors find it difficult to work together.
So let's look at differentials by using a particular case. It's one of our patterns of strategy called Marketect, and the example we're going to use is about the Honda-Yamaha motorbike war of 1981 to 1983. In the early 1980s, Honda and Yamaha were the two biggest motorcycle manufacturers in the world. At the start, both actors were pretty similar. In power terms, they were balanced in terms of the strength each had, and each had multiple concentration operating in the same markets and with around 60 models designed for the same market segments. And in a herdy kind of way, they were co-evolving with incremental stretch and synchronized in speed, each releasing equivalent models for the annual bike shows. Honda was slightly ahead at the leading edge of the herd, not really for anything they were doing at the time, more of a historic legacy. The differentials are wafer thin, and this was and had been a very stable relationship. But at the time, Honda was focusing on its cars, and Yamaha saw an opportunity to seize market leadership in motorcycles and decided to take it, using a critical mass approach that involved building the world's biggest motorcycle factory and exploiting the economies of scale that would provide. Yamaha calculated that this would reduce their costs and enable them to undercut Honda's bikes, a strength move which would take Yamaha to stronger and push Honda back into being weaker. And if Yamaha was stronger, then they could shape the coupling, pushing Honda to react to Yamaha's moves and giving Yamaha the ability to take the leading edge position away from Honda, pushing Honda back into the herd. As soon as Yamaha alters a differential, strength in this case, the coupling takes on a different feel and a different trajectory. It was stable, now the increase in differential alters the trajectory and destroys the stability. Honda had options. It could have replied in kind, matching power with power, but because of its focus on cars, it couldn't invest to the same degree that Yamaha did. Instead, using foresight, it could see what Yamaha was doing. It's hard to build the world's biggest motorbike factory without anyone knowing, so Honda could figure out what Yamaha were trying to do. Honda responded, but not in kind. Instead of trying to match power with power, Honda chose instead to redesign the market. They waited until Yamaha were fully committed to bringing their factory on stream, and they used that time to reduce the cycle time for new product introduction. That made Honda faster and Yamaha slower, although Yamaha didn't know that yet. Honda also built up their agility by reconfiguring their product development and operational capabilities so that they were able to put together and reconfigure multidisciplinary teams really quickly. That meant that they could significantly increase the number of products they could bring to market. Honda then proceeded to outdevelop Yamaha. Over the next 18 months, Honda introduced 113 new models, practically tripling the number of their models. As Honda brought out many more models to the market, they altered their concentration to diffuse. In the process, they introduced a new paradigm and value propositions based on style and design, and that redrew the segmentation of the market. Their bikes were designed specifically for smaller market niches, with new fashions and styling specific to each niche. Honda deliberately split each market segment that Yamaha's bikes had been designed for, so that Yamaha had no bikes that were suited for these smaller market niches. Yamaha was confounded. Suddenly, Yamaha's range looked old-fashioned, but of course they were available in huge numbers, so they had even less cachet and were even less desirable. Yamaha, who were already heavily engaged in trying to get their new factory working effectively, tried to react to Honda's shaping move, but managed over only 37 model changes. Honda were out developing them at a rate of almost 4-to-1. At the end of 18 months, Yamaha were left with approximately 12 months worth of unsold stock and gave up the battle. So in riposte, Honda had altered the differentials in 4 of the 6 elements, nearly simultaneously. From Yamaha's perspective, this was now a fast-moving, highly energetic, unstable structural coupling. So you'll see the dynamic interplay here. One actor does something which has an effect on the other. And it's also important to recognise the role of speed. The guts of the strategy were played out in about 18 months. And that speaks to the huge advantage of being able to formulate strategy quickly. Taking months over it just doesn't hack it in the cut and thrust duel of corporate competition, which can change pace really, really quickly.
So here's another example of a pattern of strategy, and this one's the authority. It's a player in a particular market or sector who doesn't necessarily produce whatever it is that the sector produces, but instead it stands among those who do and uses deep expertise to influence the direction of the sector. So it acts as a constant, powerful presence. The strategy begins when you start to develop deep, rich expertise about the sector, and some of the, authority and strength comes from the coverage, the completeness of the data and information about all aspects of the sector, and that makes you stronger relative to the rest of the market. That's entry level, but the real value to you, if you're playing this strategy, comes when you can step beyond aggregating information about how things are for each organisation, and additionally use your broad sectoral knowledge to outline the direction and rate of travel for the sector. You can build an ecosystem map, and that will show whose strategies are setting the direction for the herd, all the way through to the laggards at the back of the herd. You'll need some stretch from you to produce this, going from having coverage of information to interpretation of that information to generate insight. And if you are truly authoritative, then as you publish your views on the ecosystem and on the herd, you'll shape the herd and there'll be a reaction from the herd. It will trigger stretch in them. Laggards will be visible as such and are really likely to work on catch-up. Herd members on the edge have a choice about whether or not to stay as they are. And interestingly, the stronger the authority gets, the more it can shape, and the more it shapes, the stronger it gets. And that's why it's really, really hard to displace an incumbent authority. As an example of an organisation which plays the authority strategy, then in the IT sector, both Gartner and Forrester adopt this approach. And here's our final pattern of strategy for this session, the Crusader strategy. This takes a position outside the herd, aiming to win the herd over to their position and their values. Crusaders differentiate on the value set. They're on a mission to change the world. They're not just playing for their own advantage. But because it's a strategy based on values, then what they do may not be all that different from the herd they've just left. What's different is why they do it, and what they hope to achieve by doing it. So you start this strategy by looking for current customers who are disenchanted with what's on offer. Are there enough of them to provide you with a market segment that you can fill and then grow? If you think there are, then you'll use two types of stretch, a radical change in how you do what you do, and a paradigm stretch in why you're working that way. From the customer viewpoint, they also have a paradigm shift in why they're choosing your offering, and maybe some radical change in how they buy. As you deliver your offering to increasing numbers of customers, you build your relative strengths. All your marketing, all your execution, they need to be totally congruent with the values part of the brand promise to be a true crusader. Your competitors are likely to react, and you push them into providing something similar to your offering, or risk the loss of a market segment which hopefully now has higher margins. If you can pull this off, your stance on values makes you a herd leader and pushes others back towards the lagging edge. And your values are now an intrinsic part of the offering, which is what you wanted. As an example of Crusader strategy, the development and sharing of open source code is often seen this way.
So you've seen several examples of patterns. This is strategy development, designing the sequence of manoeuvres which will deliver advantage to you. But then there's that historically tricky transition from strategy development to strategy execution. Patterns of strategy has some useful characteristics when it comes to that, so we'll touch on those here. One of its advantages is that it's very straightforward to go from the manoeuvres you want to accomplish directly to the shifts in capability you need to make those happen. We'll use Honda Yamaha as an example and look at just one or two of the manoeuvres. To achieve each manoeuvre, which organisational capabilities do you need to change? How much does their performance need to be improved? When do you need that to be done by to meet the time frame of the strategy? Precision is critical here. It's not just a get more agile, for example. Which capabilities do you need to be more agile and by how much? So if you need to increase your rate of product launch from 12 a year to 120 in 18 months, you know you need a roughly 7-fold improvement in cycle time and change rate for product development. The shifts in capability directly feed the transformation plan. Each shift in capability is a chunk of work that needs to go into the plan, and the sequence of the manoeuvres tells you the sequence in which the capabilities must be ready to be put to work. So the definition of manoeuvres directly generates the execution plan. You can quickly identify which parts of the organisation are engaged in executing the strategy, how they're affected, how they'll need to change, and how fast the strategy will need that change to happen. Equally, it's easy to identify which parts of the organisation aren't directly involved, so your execution plan can be far more focused. Patterns also helps with tracking the delivery of your strategy and the impact it's having. You can directly and easily monitor progress of the capability shifts and the aspects of your execution plan that are directly in your control. They're important because they tell you if you're doing what you need to do, but they don't give you a full measurement picture. To know if you've successfully changed your strategic fit, you also need a set of outcome indicators that'll tell you whether the strategy is actually having the external impact you need. And because we model the other actor in the coupling, it's easy to work out what these should be. These tell you whether your internal capability shifts have had an effect on your fit and whether that has achieved an advantage for you. So you need metrics about shift in fit, about the effect your strategy is having on the other party in the coupling. And it also helps with crafting a succinct and clear internal communication of the strategy. We generally include what your situation will be like when the strategy is complete, what the major changes in the 6 elements are, the capability shifts needed to bring that about, and the output and outcome metrics you need to know if your strategy is working.
We've already shown the manoeuvres for a number of different patterns of strategy, and we have altogether more than 100 patterns, so they're codified strategies that we've seen in play and working for the actor using them. But the full description of a pattern is more than just the manoeuvres. It starts with a definition in terms of the impact that the strategy has on the structural coupling. Then there's a descriptive overview. There's also typical use for the strategy. What type of player is it best suited to? Is there a particular timing when this strategy can be most effective? And importantly, if you can pull it off, what's the nature and size of the prize? We define the strategy shopping list, if you will, what you'll need to be able to execute it, and then we weave that into the manoeuvres. There's a description of each manoeuvre, together with some indicative indicators that you can use to track how it's all going. We recognise that a strategy has a shelf life and that at some point the environment or the coupling or both will have changed, and that strategy may not be serving you well anymore. It may not be to your advantage. So re-evaluate this strategy if gives you some of the warning signs to look out for. And finally, there's an example or two of a real company which has used the strategy.
We have more than 100 patterns, as Lucy said, and they're grouped into 9 strategy families. Some of those are families about the coupling, supplier strategies or market changing strategies. One is about you, strategies for small players, which offers ideas on how to overcome the disadvantages of being weaker in power. Some are about the type of use or context, so growth, defence, collaboration, competition, and managing the herd. And there's one for its inherent nature, cunning planned, which uses cunning and guile to get a result. These coded strategies can provide some additional ideas, approaches to think about when developing your strategy. They're not there to be used by rote, but instead used to enrich your thinking and broaden your strategic repertoire.
Overall then, we've found several major advantages using patterns of strategy. First of all, as we've shown, it's significantly faster, and that means that you can repeat and review your strategy development much more often and keep it current and relevant. In terms of context or strategic situation, patterns can handle strategy for a competitive coupling or a collaborative one, or one which is a bit of both, and these last are increasing. Looking on a bigger canvas, it's possible to build a model of your whole ecosystem or market or environment, who's in the herd, who's on the edge, what strategies are being played out, what are the current trajectories in the herd, where are the conflicts, and that adds even more richness to your strategy debate, and also helps you spot second order effects which could be relevant to you, changes in a coupling you're not in, but which could have consequences for you. We've used patterns at all scales, from a team or department within an organisation to large global corporations. Here's another advantage: the transition from strategy development to strategy execution, which is so often a failure point, is made much more straightforward and transparent because the manoeuvres help you be really precise about the capability shifts you need to make. And finally, patterns is part of something wider, the bigger decision action cycle from environment to strategy to organisation to transformation plan and back again.
We hope you found this webinar useful and thought-provoking. There are lots of options of what you might choose to do next. There's a Patterns of Strategy book. We offer live training on either open or in-house events. There's an online training program. We also have a strategy toolkit based on strategy boards and cards which can accompany the training so you can experiment with different couplings and manoeuvres and develop strategies for yourself. And we have a software version of the toolkit. Or you might want to become a partner using the approach with your clients and colleagues. Whatever you choose, bon voyage and good luck with all your strategy endeavours.